What's going on, guys? This is Jake at That Fit Friend, and today I am joined with my friend
Brandon, back in the basement.
Basement Brandon. A lot of you already know him on YouTube, but today we're going to be talking about different types of shoes that lifters will use for deadlifting. We're going to talk about why we like each, why we sometimes don't like each. But that being said, let's dive in.
Let's get into it.
So this right here is probably the best shoe for deadlifting, right?
The Nike Freeze, a tried traditional classic.
But on a serious note, we need to add some context here, because before we talk about the different types of shoes we prefer for deadlifting and what lifters will traditionally use, we want to talk about what not to use.
Right.
And so we were talking about before this video, what we see a lot of lifters start deadlifting in. When they first start their lifting journey, or they're starting to get a little bit more specific, and we had mentioned, let's say like 3 points in a shoe that you obviously don't want when you are trying to deadlift, especially with more weight. So the first point is,
well, the first thing is the actual heel itself, right? Most people, when they first go to the gym, they're just gonna wear some general training shoes, which these are, right? They're good for a lot of things, but they're not particularly good at any given one thing. But for deadlift, the main thing you're doing is pressing the bar away from the floor. Most people say, try to think like you're doing like a leg press. The problem is with squishy soles is,
you're gonna start losing stability. So as you press into the floor, you're gonna start to shake, and as weight starts to get heavier, that can obviously be more problematic from a mechanical point of view.
Exactly right. So stability is huge with shoes, especially when it comes to deadlift, being able to plant your feet or ground your feet more appropriately. And traditionally, these shoes are just not great at it because they're very cushioned for other high impact type stuff.
And that takes us into our second point, which is stack height. So the stack height of a shoe is the amount of material that separates your foot from the floor. And now with deadlifts, you want to basically limit as much stack height as possible. Now, if you're just doing cross training and CrossFit workouts, it's likely not the biggest deal if you're pulling with a cross training shoe that does have a bit of a stack height. But if you're pulling in something like a Nike Free, this stack height is going to, once again, just make you very much more unstable. And now, do you remember what the first pair of shoes you ever deadlifted in?
The first pair of shoes I ever deadlifted in were actually a pair of Nike Frees.
I was gonna say mine were too. It was like a Nike Free, like whatever 2.0 or whatever, like one of the first OG
Black
models.
and white, not these fancy knit models. But to Jake's point earlier, the stack height, think of it like this. When you're doing something like a block pull, what that's doing is shortening the range of motion. It's easier to do. Doing something like a deficit is going to be harder because it increases the range in motion. And when you have a high stack height, it's almost like you're putting yourself at a deficit compared to just lifting straight from the floor.
And then the third point that we want to talk about is the toe box width in most training shoes isn't great, so you really can't splay the toes and grip the floor when you are tugging, or just at least let your feet do their thing when you're pulling weight. But then also something else that I want to talk about, like a 3.5, is outsole traction. So in a lot of traditional training shoes, you're not going to have full rubber outsoles, and that can limit the grip you have on the floor, which can obviously be problematic if you're doing any form of sumo or hybrid stance pulling, because you're going to slide out, you're going to slip out, and then when you factor in the limited toe box, you're going to start to have security issues into that lateral sidewall of the shoe. And do you have any other points to add there?
Yeah, like we said before, stability is huge when it comes to any form of lifting, especially deadlifting. If you're not able to splay your toes, get a good grip to the floor, and be close and glued to the floor, you can also see issues with your knees coming in and whatnot, not being able to fully brace against it. So again, you want to make sure that you're using a shoe that's going to give you the best possibility outcome of lifting the most weight. And unfortunately, shoes like this just aren't it.
Exactly. And that all said, let's dive in to our first deadlifting shoe. So the first model is what we would call like the most like general shoe for deadlifting, and this is what a lot of beginners will start to use once they start to focus a little bit more on their footwear choice for deadlifting, and that is something like a Vans, Converse, or in this case like a Reebok Lifter PR. This is very much similar to like a high top Converse. Obviously this is a little bit more specialized, and we could talk about that in a second, but we're using it as a placeholder for like a Vans Skate High, Converse Chuck Taylor All-Star High. And now, Brandon, let's talk about 3 reasons why somebody might find Vans or a shoe like this beneficial for deadlifting.
Sure, well, let me start off by saying I think the most general use case of a reason why someone might use these is a lot of people already have these shoes, right? These are probably the most socially acceptable shoes. Vans, Converse, also very stylish depending on your sense of fashion, but you might already have a pair of these in your closet. So going out and not having to buy a new pair of shoes for deadlifting, and some of the features that we'll cover in a second, could be very conducive to helping you pull more. So I think the first point that I would pull out with reasons why I would use one of these, which I have used Converse and obviously I have used these before in the past, is the fact that they're actually pretty flat. So they don't have a lot of turn up in the toe or anything like that, like you would with a running shoe, which means you can feel more connected to the floor because you have all points of contact from your big toe, pinky toe, and your heel itself.
Yeah, so if you're looking at a shoe and you see a lot of like toe spring, for example, that's gonna be a little bit more of an issue when you are trying to deadlift, because then it's gonna shift you forward and you're gonna try to put your foot into the ground, then you have to bring your heel down. And so Converse, Vans, these Reebok Lifter PRs do a really good job at that. Now the second feature is the outsole tread. If you look at most Vans models, these Reebok Lifter PRs, and Converse Chuck Taylor All-Stars before they get faded, they have a pretty good outsole tread regarding the rubber on them. Now, fun fact, did you know that Converse are actually classified as slippers? And that's to save on shipping internationally, so that's why when they start to fade, they get fuzzy underneath.
I learned something today.
The outsole tread is really important because obviously if you're deadlifting on rubber gym floors, wooden platforms and whatnot, you want something to grip more, which is also why we don't recommend most training shoes that don't have full rubber outsole treads. And now the third reason, we talked about flatter construction, we talked about outsole tread. What else should we mention here as to why these shoes can be good for deadlifting?
Yeah, so we've talked before about having like a squishy sole, you know, not being able to have that stability. Typically with these shoes, they are very rigid, they're very stiff. They're a little bit clunky, some might say, but for deadlifting where you want to feel glued to the ground, that can be beneficial. So the fact that these have a relatively flat sole and a harder sole at that, you're going to be able to transfer more force between the ground and yourself when pushing. But that being said, even though that these are relatively flat, they're harder, we still do potentially, depending on the shoe you're looking at, have some stack height issues.
And for Vans and Converse, now that Converse do have a wide option, you are gonna have a narrow toe box too. So as Brandon mentioned, as we get way more specific with your training, like you might wanna bring the stack height down, which is what our next three models will all have in common. And that said, let's dive into our second shoe. The second shoe we want to discuss is a wrestling shoe. So you'll see a lot of lifters, especially newer power lifters, opt for wrestling shoes. Three reasons why wrestling shoes can work is number one, these are gonna have a lower stack height, so these will bring you closer to the floor. So when we're talking about ground feel, getting you closer to limit that range of motion, a wrestling shoe can be really great at that. Also, number two.
Yeah, with the soles themselves, like we mentioned, it has a low stack height, but it's very minimal, and also it's just going to really let you grip the floor. You think about people that are wrestling, they have to be able to be nimble on their toes all the time, being able to move really well, which is a really great feature. However, to the point we've already talked about, being on your toes, these do tend to have a little bit more of a toe spring in the front, which for me is kind of a little bit of a negative.
Yeah, because when you think about wrestling too, you're always going to be going forward for the most part. So you can see here there's a little bit of a toe spring in this model, and these are pretty dang faded. So I'm sure out of the box there was even more.
Right. Nice things about these, they're very minimal too. So it's like, it's not as minimal as a slipper, which we'll take a look at in a second, but the materials, they're very lightweight. They are the opposite of clunky, don't weigh a lot, not a ton, so they really feel light on your feet. And again, let you get that good connection to the floor for the reasons we've already mentioned.
And then the third reason why I think wrestling shoes can be decent for some lifters is most wrestling shoes have a more aggressive, higher boot. And if you like a little bit more ankle support or boot support, which isn't always technically mechanically proficient in most deadlifts, this can be a good option to look into. And now obviously you might have to play with the boot tightness to figure out what works for you with your mechanics, but if you do traditionally like a higher boot, that would be something to look into with a wrestling shoe. Now, a couple of other issues with a wrestling shoe, in my opinion, is the outsole tread here. So for example, here on Brandon's model, we have rubber, and then a lot of like a cloth or synthetic material. That's obviously not ideal, especially if you're pulling on wooden platforms. And then also, do you want to talk about the width?
Yeah, the width on these usually tends to be pretty narrow. I haven't seen many wrestling shoes kind of adapt to the trend of wider toe boxes. These tend to be pretty compact. So if you're on the wider foot range, these are going to be extremely uncomfortable to wear.
And then the last caveat with wrestling shoes is that unlike the Vans, Converse, and like the Reebok Lifter PR technically, you can't really wear them outside of the gym. So you're gonna lose out on functionality there. And then you were also mentioning price.
Yeah, so the price on these can get pretty high. You can get a fairly basic wrestling shoe for fairly cheap, but as you get into the more specific ones with some of the nicer features that maybe these ones are lacking on, it gets more expensive, and you need to ask yourself, if you're gonna spend the money on a specialty shoe, are you better off buying one specifically made for deadlifting?
And that said, let's actually dive into our favorite shoes for deadlifting. So we are into Brandon's favorite type of shoe to deadlift, and that is the deadlift slipper. So we have two different slippers up here. And now Brandon, let's talk about why you like these slippers for deadlifting. I know you like one of these more than the other.
Yeah, so first of all, I will say, A lot of my preferences come down to two things. Number one, performance. Number two, how lazy I am. So for these shoes, literally, as the term implies, slippers, they slip on, slip off. So if I'm going to deadlift either at the beginning of a workout, after squats, after something, like the last thing I want to do is worrying about putting on equipment or gear in order to do that. That can include things like tying laces. These ones, literally, they have Velcro to tighten them down. I typically just put them at a point where I can just slip them right on. Very easy to put on, and once they're on, they don't feel like anything. So there's pros and cons with that, right? So for a traditional slipper, I look at it as like a sock with a sole on it. So for a lot of people who like deadlifting barefoot, but maybe can't because of the gym they're at, or they're competing in powerlifting, the slipper would be the next closest evolution of just lifting barefoot.
100%. It's like almost like a similar to like what I think of as like a water shoe. Like I've competed in water shoes before, but that's because you need like the closed toe box, the heel. And so that said, with a slipper, you're gonna have a super minimalist sole. So speaking as to why also we like deadlift slippers for deadlifting is the limited stack height. So this is gonna get you really close to the ground. It's gonna give you a lot of ground feel. So if once again, you love having as much proprioception as possible with the ground, a slipper can be a really good bet. And now you were mentioning this before, but you actually like the upper for some reasons, but obviously other reasons it can fall short. Can you elaborate there?
Yeah, so with these shoes, if you will, or slippers, if I should, like I said, very minimal type material. It's basically like a sock with a sole on it. And because of that, it's very elastic up top on the upper, which means that no matter how wide your foot is, it's going to kind of adapt to that fit, instead of being constrained in. So the fact that I can get these on with my slightly wider feet, even though these aren't marketed as a wide toe box, they fit really well in that regard.
And now one more thing to talk on with slippers I feel like that's worth mentioning is not all slippers are created equal regarding lateral upper stability. And so for our sumo deadlifting friends out there, the cheaters, you end up having a little bit of spillover when you're really trying to spread and push the floor apart. So that's where I feel like this slipper would come in. And now can we talk a little bit on that model?
Yeah, the downside of the slipper model that I prefer, which is again, let's just say sock with a sole on it, is the fact that the lateral support is just not there, because as you push out, you tend to kind of spill over the side a little bit. There's no sidewall. There are other versions, in this case specifically from Notorious Lift, which has a higher sidewall. You take a look at some other shoes like the Sabo deadlift shoes or the new Avances deadlift shoes, they do have a bigger sidewall built up. That being said, for someone like me who pulls conventional, however, it's not really a necessity. So depending on how you pull, you might want to take a look at different models like this, which have more of a, what I would consider the scientific term of clunky, and you have more sidewall built up and more rigidity there, so that when you press your feet out, you do have something to push against and you're not spilling over the sides.
And before we wrap this section up, are there any other points on slippers that you want to talk on?
Yeah, Jake made a good point of considering or comparing these to water shoes. And in fact, I know a lot of people that go on Amazon and search for water shoes and find very similar type designs. Now, the benefit of something like this is in regards to the other shoes we're talking about, the price point on slippers tend to be a little bit lower because again, there's not as much material. But on the flip side of that, depending on your money spending habits, spending $40 to $50 for a pair of slippers or socks with soles on them might be more on the expensive side.
Especially if you already have training shoes. And I feel like for the beginner intermediate that's not super specific or doesn't plan to compete, you likely don't need to spend an extra $50 on these pairs of shoes. You could probably just go barefoot, wear Vans and whatnot. But as you obviously get more specific, that becomes more important. But let's talk about our final shoe for deadlifting, which is my personal favorite shoe to deadlift in.
Best for last, according to some.
So the final shoe, AKA the best for last, is a barefoot shoe. So barefoot shoes have obviously grown a lot in popularity over the last few years, but they can be phenomenal shoes for deadlifting. And let's talk about 3 reasons as to why that is. Number 1, limited stack height. So with a barefoot shoe, you get a lot of flexibility, you get a lot of proprioception with the ground, and you're gonna limit the amount of material that separates your foot from the floor. This can be really great for cutting down on the range of motion with your deadlift when you can't necessarily pull barefoot or you plan to compete and you want a shoe for that. Now, the second reason why barefoot shoes are awesome for deadlifting.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about toe boxes and width, and barefoot shoes are typically more anatomically correct. So any barefoot shoe, you're gonna have a bigger, wider toe boxes, which is gonna let you splay your toes, get better grip. And as Jake already mentioned, with the limited stack height, you're gonna get that much closer to the ground. So typically, besides a slipper like we've already talked about, this kind of offers all the benefits of some of the shoes we've discussed, but also adds in some of the stuff of being as close to the ground as possible and feeling very minimalistic.
And then the third reason, so we have stack height, we have width. Generally, they'll have a good level of grip on most barefoot shoe soles, and so I don't want to really harp on that too much, but I think the reason why I love barefoot shoes the most for deadlifting is because you get that cross functionality. Like with this pair, so this is the Tolos Archetype 1, this is the Vivo Barefoot Primus Lite 3, you can wear these for daily wear, you can use them for the rest of your training. So if you just want to buy one shoe that you know is really great for deadlifting, but that you can use for other types of training that is really great regarding flexibility, stack height, etc., a barefoot shoe I think fits that bill really, really well. And now, do you have any other topics that you want to talk on with a barefoot shoe for deadlifting?
So I'd agree with Jake on that sense. Like I wear the Tolos specifically outside of training all the time, and it's really nice to have a shoe that's really good at deadlifting, but also really being good at other things. We've talked about a lot of these shoes are specific to 1 or 2 use cases only. You can get a lot of use cases out of these, so I definitely see the appeal of these. The downside for me, however, on these, and for most people though, is the price. So what are average prices of a good barefoot shoe?
So the Tolos model, we're looking around like 110, and then Vivo Barefoot, forget about it. They can go from like 150 to 200. I'm wearing the new Modus model, and that was 200, plus you factor in shipping. I spent entirely way too much for this shoe, and that is obviously a major knock, especially for beginners and intermediates who don't need to necessarily drop that much. And I think if you are thinking about going the barefoot shoe route, I would argue that probably Tolos is one of the better models, especially for the price point. But yeah, price can be a huge, huge turnoff with them. And now I'm curious, because this is totally separate out of deadlift shoes. I think as more companies come up, I'm gonna hopefully go on a limb here to say that we'll see more competitive pricing. I feel like Vivo is so expensive because like they are kind of like the big dog right now regarding premium performance barefoot shoes. So I'm hoping that we'll kind of see a trend to bring down those prices a little bit.
I think we'll see that. More shoe companies are noticing that people are interested in not only minimalistic shoes, but barefoot type shoes. We've seen it with the tier 1 lifters that have come out recently, a lot of the newer deadlift shoes that are on the market as well, wider toe box. And as more competition comes to the market, I do think we'll see those prices come down. One thing I did want to touch upon though with the barefoot shoes, if you're planning on using these for everyday use, sometimes it is a bit of adjustment, but I do believe you have some videos about that with your shoes and transitioning, don't you?
I do, yeah. I have a barefoot shoe guide where I talk about like my favorite ways to transition and how to kind of just acclimate to this, because this will be a lot more force going into your foot. It's going to change the range of motion of your ankle and foot a little bit, so you'll definitely want to ease into them. But yeah, we have a ton of content on that. But that said, man, cool. I'm curious, your favorite barefoot shoe right now, is it the...
Right now, for me, it's the Notorious Lift slippers, although I do pull in the Tolos a lot, as well as the Vivo. The nice thing about having all these is options. I think when it comes down to it, however, there are so many options out there. There's a lot of differences of opinion depending on the way that you pull, from what you feel like to what you want to spend, that obviously you're going to have to make the best informed decision for yourself at the end of the day.
Nice, I love it. And if you have a favorite shoe for deadlifting, especially a barefoot shoe, let us know in the comments below, because I'm curious what other folks like when it comes to tugging big weight. All right, y'all, that wraps up this video talking about some of our favorite shoes for deadlifting and what shoes not to deadlift in. Brandon, do you have anything else to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, just when it comes to gym equipment and stuff, obviously you want to get the most bang for your buck. So if you're also going to be the type where you're going to squat in barefoot type shoes or minimalistic type shoes, you might want to take into some of those considerations as well. Or if you're looking to get a shoe that's going to be all purpose, like we mentioned, again, you want to take a look at the total picture, because we know a lot of people don't have $200 to spend on a shoe for just one specific use case in the gym.
I love it. That's a pro tip right there. Well, thank you so much for coming on the channel. I sincerely appreciate it. I'm going to have all of Brandon's info linked down below. But as always, y'all, if you have questions, drop a comment below. Reach out to us personally. Drop a like on the video. Subscribe to the channel. We'll see you in the next one.
And as always, stay big.